evening is titled Haiti's Open Wounds, Eyewitness Accounts on its Relentless Humanitarian Crisis. Jackie Aldrette will moderate our panel this evening. She is Managing Director of AFSCs-USA. Let's welcome Jackie.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and good evening to everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to just do a little introduction to our talk tonight, and then I'll introduce our two guests, Fiammetta and Joe. So, presentation when you guys are ready. Over here, great. All right, so I don't know about you, but over the last year and even more, Haiti's been very much on my mind and in my heart. We've seen just so many disasters, right, that it's almost hard to bear. Haiti's been all over the news cycle this past year, and even going back further, and it hasn't been pretty. The multiple crises in Haiti over the past few years have contributed to a sad and confusing situation, where the deeper story of how the country became mired in human suffering, corruption, and underdevelopment is very muddled. So in this panel, we'll have the chance to hear from a journalist who's covered Haiti for years, and does so by asking probing questions and unpacking the complex factors at play. And from a development aid worker who is steadfast in her commitment to the Haitian people and brings us a message of certain hope. Now, as we were preparing for this panel, I kind of realized that I think I know something about Haiti's history, but it was a bit foggy. So I'm going to do us all the little favor of a very quick history lesson about Haiti, just to kind of set the stage and then get into our conversation with our two guests. Now, this is not a very super well-researched history lesson. It's just kind of, again, setting the stage. So it's much more complex than I'm going to make it seem. Haiti is a really unique country, right? It was a country that started full of hope and promise. The island nation of Haiti, as we all know, is actually half of the island of Hispaniola, discovered by Columbus in 1492, when it was already inhabited by some native tribes. The Spanish and then the French explorers colonized the island, with the French bringing slaves in large numbers. At the end of the 18th century, the slaves organized and revolted against their French owners. And if you pay attention to the time period, it was just around the same time that we ourselves had gone through our revolution. So it was kind of within the same revolutionary spirit of independence and freedom. It took 12 long years of battle until finally the French surrendered. And there was a competition amongst rival leaders of the upcoming Haitian political class. So 1805 is the independence of Haiti as the first the second independent nation in the hemisphere, and the first one led by the blacks. Now, a lot was going on in France at the time. We had Napoleon's waning power and influence, and the reaction in the US, just a few hundred miles away by sea, was mixed. But there was a particular wariness of the southern slaveholding plantation owners in the south of the US towards this new independent Haiti, and a lot of uncertainty about how we as a country were going to interact with Haiti. So the start, full of hope and promise, was alive, but the path forward was tumultuous from the beginning. The US didn't actually recognize Haiti as a country for about 60 years. Post-independence, was basically full of challenges related to good governance and economic development. Many of us remember from our history lessons the fact that the US Marines occupied Haiti for a time, and then of course the long Duvalier dictatorship, first Papa Doc, followed by his son Baby Doc, who was forced out in 1986, which is under Reagan. But that led to then another military regime, and then a series of presidents after that, with a weak democratic process, but a process nonetheless. And yet it's a big struggle just to put in place policies and investment to really get the country kind of on its feet. In terms of how the US interacted with Haiti in this time, on and off embargoes, use of foreign assistance as a tool to promote human rights and democracy building without a whole lot of success, widespread corruption and lack of faith in government, and basically context of massive poverty and environmental degradation. The picture on the top is just a dramatic one, if you've seen it before. It shows the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic. And so obviously what you're seeing is massive deforestation, which of course is on one hand a result of poverty, because people rely on wood for fuel, and as well, kind of one of those factors that perpetuates the situation of the country. The U.S. has been committing significant foreign aid over this time, again with a lot of political, you could say maybe political interference. Then we had a refugee crisis in the 70s, 80s, and on, and that the picture at the bottom there is the boat, people leaving Haiti trying to get their way to the U.S. One thing that's really significant to note is this last statistic. That Haiti might be the country with the biggest brain drain problem, right? Where 4/5 of Haiti's college-educated people have left the country. 2010, the earthquake of 2010 caught all of our attention, right? Massive destruction, 300,000 deaths or more. And really it was kind of a wake-up call for the international community, and do it for all of us, really, to see the state of affairs in Haiti, to see how houses could just crumble like that. And then, of course, there was a huge outpouring of support, which was beautiful, but then also we saw huge mismanagement and failures to use that money well, Then we get to 2021. Things went from bad to worse. So we can look back to just a few of the key events, right? So on February 10th, that's the day that the president, Jovenel Moïse, decided to extend his stay as president based on some technicalities of dates and of when he actually assumed power and all the rest. But it was a signal to the country that he was there to stay, and kind of that the democratic process was a bit in question. That led to extensive protests in the street. His opposition failed to come up with an alternative. And then there were months and months of protests amplifying the chaos across the country. We've seen a huge uptick in kidnappings and gang violence and fuel shortages. In June, this is just one little factoid here from June, but in June we saw 13,000 people fleeing their homes in the capital city of Port-au-Prince and going to shelters because their neighborhoods have become too violent. That's a massive number, right? And then on July 6th, the night of July 6th, the president was assassinated in his own bed, right? I mean, you can't really get anything more shocking than that. Of course, the political crisis, governance crisis ensued following the assassination of the president. August 17th, the earthquake in the south. Not quite as deadly as the earthquake in Port-au-Prince in 2010, but still wreaking havoc on the southern peninsula, followed immediately by a tropical storm. And then we had the other shocking news in October. 16 missionaries kidnapped for a ransom of $1 million per head, including children. I mean, right? Shocking, as if things couldn't get any worse. The fuel shortages have continued to make life very difficult, and they're due in part, or maybe not in part, they're due to the gangs, to the gang controls of the roads, and the gangs just control over the economy and life in Haiti. We have a prime minister in place, Henry, who has weak control. He himself is also at the mercy of the gangs, who've basically come in to fill the void. These are all the questions that we've been asking ourselves, right? Is there hope for for a child like this little boy sitting here in a shelter? Are we, as the international community, aid community, are we helping? Are we hurting? Is there any viable answer to this violence and corruption? And then, in a context like this, can we have hope? Where does our hope come from? So with that intro, we're going to move on and meet Fiammetta and Joe. Thank you. So Joe Parkin Daniels is a journalist, he's a freelance journalist who writes for The Guardian, among a few other outlets. He's based in Colombia, and he's been following Haiti for 7 or so years. So welcome, Joe, to the New York Encounter and to our panel. Fiammetta Cappellini is the regional director for AFSI. AFSI, an international organization that, as you all know, I work for as well. She's the regional director, meaning she covers Haiti, but also now Dominican Republic. But she was the country representative for Haiti for 15 years. So welcome, Fiammetta. So Joe, I'm going to begin with you. I've given a very cursory view of Haiti's past and present, but in your view, what are the main factors that have contributed to the most to the horrific conditions that we see the Haitian people living today? How have we gotten to this point?
Well, there's a Haitian expression that loosely translated means beyond mountains, there are mountains, which loosely means after one problem comes another. And in Haiti, for me, most of these problems stem from a lack of governance. We've just heard that in 2010 there was an earthquake that killed 360,000 people at least and flattened most of the capital. Last year's earthquake, while more powerful but in a more sparsely populated area in the country's southern peninsula, in that earthquake, 2,200 people died at least, 12,000 were injured, and 130,000 homes destroyed. But as Jonathan Katz, a great writer on Haiti, points out, the only number that matters is 11, the number of years between those two earthquakes. A number of years, those 11 years, in which corruption and a lack of governance led to the state being hollowed out even more than it already is, or already was. And we see this throughout. The last time the Haitian state was really able to reach all sectors of the country was during the Duvalier dictatorships. And obviously those were pockmarked with horrific violence and oppression of the opposition and so forth. And since then, there's not really been a strong government in Haiti. What we've seen is a lack of one. We've seen a president last year, Moise, who, overstaying his mandate, is assassinated his own bed in circumstances that are murky now. They'll remain murky. Like these, we're not going to find out what happened there anytime soon. And that left a power vacuum even more so. We see gangs again filling into that, which is why the kidnappings have been upticked even more. It's why neighborhoods in the capital are unable to, the police won't go into them. And beyond that, really one of the things that hit me going to Haiti the first time 5 or 6 years ago, been several times since, is when we talk about like a lack of governance or a lack of services, it can be quite abstract. But in reality, when you see it, what it means is there's no trash collection. So that means that there are just fields of trash burning, of styrofoam just burning, goats grazing on it. When there's no sewers, that means that children play and are raised in open sewers and open sewage. It means that houses flood with the stuff. It means that there's no electricity grid, at least not a reliable one, so you rely on a generator if you can afford one. And even if you can afford one, there's no fuel, so you're without power. In a country where it's plus 30 degrees centigrade, sorry, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, and so people can't store food, etc. I don't remember, last time I was in Port-au-Prince, seeing any more than one stoplight working, and that was the one by the airport. And so you see that, and then of course on top of that power vacuum, you see gangs fill in, and that really is a security crisis which I haven't seen anything like it in my 7 years in Latin America. I haven't seen something similar to that in Colombia, where I'm based. I haven't seen anything like that in Venezuela, Guatemala, etc. There are entire neighborhoods completely controlled by gangs, where driving along, you won't see another car on the road. You'll look up to the hills either side, and you won't see another person except for maybe a few guys carrying machetes wearing balaclavas. You'll see the burning chassis of a car maybe, and you'll see bullet holes in police stations. In the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, they had to shut their doors last year for that reason. And so those are kind of the issues that Haiti is dealing with right now. And to me, they really just stem from a lack of governance and a lack of a state.
Thanks, Joe. So the situation that you described vividly is a situation in which Fiammetta is working every day. And you've been doing this for many years, Fiammetta. So tell us, you and a staff of 300 people in Haiti are working in this context. Can you just give us a quick overview of the kind of work that you're doing, and just how do you manage in a situation like this? How do you manage the insecurity and all of these lacks?
So, yes, the situation is very, very difficult in the country, also for normal life, day-to-day life. I don't know, just to give you the picture, to have a home functioning in Haiti, it means that you have to have your own water, because there are no pipes arriving to each home. You have to have your own power, solar power, and the generator, and the gas for the generator, because we could have only 2 hours of power per day, and not really every day. So sometimes it's about to choose if you want the refrigerators or the fan working, because you can't have both. This is the day-by-day life for the one who could afford to have this kind of life. But the wide majority of the population living in houses where there is no power at all, no running water at all, sometimes no toilet. 90% of Haitians in the rural area have no toilet in home. So this is very unimaginable to have a country so close to United States with a so different kind of life. But this is the small-scale problem. The problem of the country are more big, and what it was Joe was telling us. So AFSI is working there, has worked there for the last most of the 20 years. And now the mission of AFSI in Haiti is quite big. We have 300 staff working there. We have 4 offices around the country. The country is very, very small. I don't have a size to the United States, but it's really, really small. And we have all these offices to be close to the field operation, because the transportation and the logistics are so difficult, and the violence could spread at any time, and we don't want to be cut out from the field operation area. So we build these offices around the country to be able to keep operation going, whatever is the problem hitting the country. And as you see by Jackie presentation, the problems hitting the country are so very difficult to afford for everybody. So our work in Haiti by now is 50% humanitarian aid response and 50% development kind of operation. This has been like that for the last, I could say, 3-4 years, because the country is going from bad to worse. Humanitarian operations are more like a big number of people that we try to help with response to basic needs. It's like cash transfer, sometimes food, fighting malnutrition in children, that also is a big problem in Haiti by now. Instead, development activities for us are more on agricultural side, because we talk about Haiti as Port-au-Prince, thinking about this big problem of the violence in the capital, but most of Haitian people live in rural area, in very small villages, and is about agriculture that is very poor agriculture without infrastructure and machine and the technologies. So we support the agricultural ministry and also the cooperation in the cooperative in the rural area to try to develop the agriculture, because it's what brings food on the table of most Haitians. And this large number of staff that AFSI has in country now is how we keep very close our activities to people, how we are in the field with them to reach as many people we can with this intervention. Yes, for sure it's difficult. We think these days that I spent here with you in the United States, a lot of people ask me what's it like for me, my life in Haiti. But I'd like to tell you what is for Haitian people life they are living by now. That is really unimaginable, really difficult. I have this, we have in office this lady that help for cleaning works in our office. She told me she wake up every morning at 4 in the morning because she has to go to the church before reaching the office. And she walked so long distance to reach the office because she doesn't want to spend money in transportation because she can walk, so she can keep money from this kind of expenses for her family. And she worked for us just for cleaning the office, and she kept telling me, "You're so tired, you work so long hours." And she's 70 years old, with 5 people on her own and without a husband to support her. And she kept telling me, "You are too tired, you work too much." Such as they really have this life so difficult, so every day to overcome this kind of problems that they are not able to see the greatest things they are doing with their life, keeping going like that. So it's hard for us to be in Haiti, sincerely difficult for our staff, for our international operators. But I'm more thinking about the Haitian people, our Haitian staff, and how hard it is for them.
Beautiful. Well, you've already just hinted a little at the resilience that you've seen in the Haitian people, and we're going to get back to that. We want to hear more about that. But, you know, one of the questions that I hinted at the beginning was this one around the role of international aid. Right, so, you know, Fiammetta talked about the humanitarian assistance and the development programs. So, luckily, we are able to, you know, tap into this system. You know, organizations like UNICEF and the World Bank, and you know, haven't completely forgotten about Haiti. So there is some aid still coming. But especially after 2010 and recently, there've been a lot of criticisms about international aid, right, and how it's been used. And so, Joe, I want to ask you about this. You know, what do you think about these criticisms? Is there any truth to these arguments that the international community has made matters worse or somehow reinforced patterns of dependence and victimization?
Well, the short answer would be yes, I think there's some truth in that statement. The long answer is far too long for us to get into now, so we'll go for somewhere in the middle. The issue you hinted at, Fiammetta, is that you have international aid serves 2 purposes in Haiti, essentially. One is emergency response, and the other is development. The problem is that when emergency response becomes so perpetual, it almost, I would say, hinders development in Haiti's case. We saw that before the 2010 earthquake, but even more so afterwards. And like aid organizations show up in their thousands. I think at one point there were 11,000 NGOs in Haiti. That led to some people labeling it an aid state. And obviously, like after an earthquake, after any natural disaster, what you need are rescuers, medics, shelter, and food. And so those things come in, but then transitioning from that to something more stable proved a lot more trickier than maybe people foresaw. For example, one of the kind of typical, kind of emblematic examples would be the rice industry in Haiti. Haiti grows rice. It's a staple, like anywhere in the Caribbean, and Haitians grew rice. But following the earthquake, a bunch of rice comes off of aid trucks and is given out free, killing the rice market. Like you go right now to all the street markets in any town or city in Haiti, and you'll see aid rice. You'll see rice with an American flag on it, and that's been given out free, which means that a farmer can no longer compete. And the same thing happens when so where are the painkillers coming from? They're coming off a truck. They're not coming from a local pharmacist. And so what the risk of things happening there is by just handing stuff out, you're fostering a kind of dependence at one level, but also killing or hindering the kernels of an economy, a local economy, which Haiti really needs to kind of grow. And then, of course, not just looking at like the big NGOs, but also just international governments, and when they come in on humanitarian missions. The UN stabilization mission after the earthquake was believed to have been responsible for the cholera outbreak, which then happened following that, in which I think it was 10,000 people died over the following 9 years, and about 800,000 infected. Cholera, one of the only countries where it was brought to Haiti, and thankfully, actually, this month is now 3 years without a case of cholera in Haiti, which is due to the work of local and foreign organizations promoting sanitation, hand washing. But yeah, so I would say large NGOs can obviously be helpful, and in a disaster, and Haiti sitting where it does in the Caribbean and on a fault line is constantly battered by disasters. Obviously, you need help. But as I say, as you said today, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and if it's not done correctly, it can end up causing more problems.
Great. So, Fiammetta, sorry, what do you think about this conversation, this discussion here? And then, can you share with us what is distinctive about AFSCs' approach to humanitarian response and development?
Yes, for sure. There are several elements in a situation so complex as Haitian one. For sure, this is, if you can say, so a very unlucky country because of all the disasters and natural disasters that hit the country. About that, just to say, the slide that Jackie showed about the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and you can see how there are no free in Haiti instead of the Dominican Republic. This is the reason why the same hurricanes that hit Haiti and hit the Dominican Republic give all this kind of destruction in Haiti, and not the same in the Dominican Republic, and it's the same island, the same geographical profile. So for sure the natural disaster, but also the weakness of the country that enlarge the impact of this kind of emergency. Yes, a natural disaster, and also a government that over the year has not been able to manage the country and to drive the development of the country. But that's not really up to us to give the reason of or an inside lecture about that. Our job is to be where we are needed to accompany what we can build on, what we can develop there. And for sure, also the international cooperation have done some mistakes over the years. For sure, we ask ourselves this question, what we could have done better than what we do. But it's not yet that the point to us. The point to us is that the situation is that now, and we have to work with that. And yes, it's difficult. Sometimes you cannot see what's the positive point you can start to build on. And this is the very question asked to our work. But over the year, I've seen so many examples of how Haitian people are not only resilient, but also strong. And how when people have the possibility to choose a life, a kind of engagement different, they choose that. The problem is so many people has not this choice. For example, our staff in Haiti, we started working this slum in Port-au-Prince, in famous slum, it's called the Cité Soleil. UN said is one of the worst place on the planet where to live. And yes, if we had 3 more hours together, I think Joe and I could talk about the Cité Soleil very, very deeply. It's really a nightmare to live there. We started as AFSCs operation there 15 years ago. And the first beneficiary of our very first project that was conflict reduction and peace building. The first young man we involved as beneficiary in this project, at the end of the project, 3-year project, they said, well, what are we doing now? The project ended and we have still no job, what we are doing here. And so we started the recruitment with them to keep them as volunteers in our project. 15 years later now, they are our social workers. And we are building with them our presence in the neighborhood. They are the reason why we can work in this kind of slums in Cité Soleil and also in Martissan. Martissan area is a very large slum, over 200,000 people living there. This is quite inaccessible right now because war between gangs. And AFSI is able to work there because of these people. There were, by the time, a young man, unemployed, with no academic degree, with any kind of job skills. And they built these skills with us, but because they wanted, because they found these possibilities through the work of AFSI. And so to us, this is what is telling us that people can, when they can choose, they choose for the better. And so there is still a possibility to build on that, to see a different kind of cooperation that for sure could be better, could be stronger, could be more professional and effective. We can say whatever we want about that. But what is important is to see what can be done, what is effective, and to keep doing that. So yes, I think there are examples of how things can work even in the most difficult slum of this difficult country.
Thanks, Fiammetta. Yeah, so you described the methodology, a way of working together with the communities, which is definitely, I would agree, is distinctive about AFSI. Getting back to one of Joe's points, though, too, I would say that, you know, we pay a lot of attention to, you know, what we've learned from the past in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then we as an organization make decisions based on what kind of aid to accept and how to use it in a way that also fosters the local economy, the local, you know, skills building of the youth, for example. I mean, there are ways of using the international aid that are more supportive of the growth of the people and the economy, or that are destructive. And we have to be smart about that, and then, you know, choose, again, as I said, choose kind of the donors we're going to work with based on whether we're able to do that kind of development. Anyway, let's then talk about, I mean, we know here that there's a multitude of crises kind of on top of each other, right? But one is the political one. So can we just, let's touch on that just for a minute. And Joe, let me ask you, is there any political solution in the works that will, you know, address this lack of governance or this void that we see in Haiti today?
To solve all of that, no, there's not one ready-made, oven-ready solution, unfortunately. But what there is, thankfully, is, as Fiammetta said, like, we're seeing more and more the Haitian society and civil society is trying to opt for change. So we're seeing the conditions for change at civil society level starting to form more than perhaps we saw before. That gives me some hope that there can be a political solution eventually. In terms of, like, immediately in the halls of power, that's a bit messy. And to distill it as simply as I can, there's essentially two current camps. One is the camp of Ariel Henry, who is the current prime minister, acting prime minister supposedly, but he'll be acting for a while. He's kind of tacitly backed by the US government, and there's one group that says Ariel Henry should call elections tomorrow, and the thinking being that his party, Moise's party as well, will basically win easily because they have the political machinery in place to do so. That's one camp. There's another camp which is formed from a group of Haitian business people and people in the Haitian diaspora, and they more advocate for holding off on elections, saying that there aren't the conditions for elections right now because when you have so much violence, when people are too scared to go shopping or to go to work or take their kids to school, they're certainly going to be unable to go and vote, especially when elections have been pockmarked with violence historically in Haiti. So they call for a kind of rule by committee for a bit, and then call elections when the conditions are more apt. Obviously, neither of those solutions are ideal, but the fact that there's actually some creative thinking going on is quite refreshing, and rather than it just being, you know, the ones shouting loudest barging in, which often happens.
Okay, well, let's see where that goes. Fiammetta, let's get to this core question about hope. Are you hopeful for the future of Haiti?
It's a question a lot of people ask. How all these difficulties and needs, how to look at them and say that there is hope for this country. And still we see that. And it's not up to us to bring, we cannot be the solution for the country. The country has its own problem and has to find their solution. That's not up to us. What it's up to us is to be there where people need us. And to that, people don't ask us to bring hope. They are so proud, Haitian people, they are so strong. We have nothing to give them more than this resilience, this strength that they have. What they need is for us to be there to show that we care, to show that we do not think that the country is a lost cause. That is really harming them to think that to the world is a closed chapter, because a lot of aid has already been done here, so we are not bringing any more. And so to feel so abandoned by the international community. The hope we can eventually bring is really to be there. Also, a lot of people keep asking us, in a so deep crisis with a problem this size, the help we can bring is so small, is not changing things. And again, I think for AFSI, it's not about changing things at the country level for the country, but for the people, for each person we meet. So for this person, the problem is to send the child to school, and the $5 for the shoes for this child, this is the solution. So this kind of solution, every little help we are bringing is really helping. And yes, we see the scale of the problem as we are frightened by that. So keep telling us we work, we bring our lives here to live with them, with all these kind of needs, and we cannot change the future of the country, but we can change the future of this child, of this person we meet. And also on a small scale, it kind of grow and become a large impact that we are having, and I think that this is the hope. Also the hope for the people to see that there is a possibility. They can choose. They are not left alone with a future that is not really imaginable in this moment, but that we are bringing choices to them, and that they can choose a different life, and they can build their life. But really on a small scale to grow, and for every single person, not for the country, for the problem, for the Haitian cause, but for every person.
Joe, do you want to add anything on to that point?
Yeah, well, I agree with Fiammetta, and I think like the people that you referenced, that now work as social workers, that were once in gang-ridden areas, were once part of gangs, that to me is a sign of hope. Like the fact that transition exists, that it's still there, and that people are still working to strengthen that transition. There is hope. That gangs do sit down and come to the table and negotiate. This isn't it's so easy, and I know I probably gave the impression as well that to think that Haiti is a complete basket case. But it's not. It's a country, a vibrant culture, an amazing, beautiful place with 11.4 million people in it who just want the best for themselves, as we all do. And so I think that there is it's a country of people striving for better. It's a country that could use support and the right kind of support. And I think that if it's those issues that we've spoken about, those kind of systemic issues can be overcome, then there's a bright future and something we can actually kind of be happy about for Haiti.
Well, we got to our happy note here, which I'm so glad about, because we didn't want to leave you with, desperation, because that doesn't really help anyone, does it? So I'm sure you have more questions, and we're going to conclude here, but we'll be around, and our speakers will be around, so we're happy to keep chatting and hear more about, talk more about what you're interested in. But, on a personal note, we all need witnesses, right? People whose lived experience and awareness puts us in front of an essential truth that touches us and stays with us. My life has been marked by many of these witnesses, and you've just met one of them, Fiammetta. So I'm really glad to have been able to bring Fiammetta here tonight to introduce her to you, many of my friends. But thank you both. Thank you, Joe, for coming. Thank you, Fiammetta. I mean, I say on behalf of AFSI-USA, but I think on behalf of many of you too, that we will not forget the Haitian people, nor you, Fiammetta, and your staff, and your family. So thank you for sharing both your pain and your hope with us tonight.